You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to Agriculture Today. For the first part of today's broadcast, we'll be reflecting on grain sorghum research, past, present, and future. And we have two individuals here who are well steeped in that topic, and they have spent a lot of years developing and advancing grain sorghum as a production crop here in the U.S. Professor Emeritus of Agronomy at Kansas State University, Richard Vanderlip, and Scott Staggenborg, who is the Vice President, Research and Development with Chromatin Incorporated out of Lubbock, Texas. A grain sorghum research firm. Scott is a former research and extension agronomist here at K-State. Scott, want you to, if you would, outline our reason for gathering here and going over some of the advances in grain sorghum research.
Certainly, Eric. So at the recent Sorghum Research Conference, there was some discussion around the fact that we have a lot of knowledge and historical information basically in the minds and in the heads of people like Richard, people that were pioneers in sorghum research, both in the industry as well as in the public domain, and that as these people age, our opportunities to extract some of these stories, some of this information, some of the reasons behind it. It's easy to read a extension publication, a research journal article, and sort of get a flavor of what the research was, but the real flavor around the maybe how that research came about, that doesn't come forward. And so it was suggested that we capture these treasures in a way that will last much longer than any of us.
That's why we have your colleague here who goes back a long ways as far as his experiences and accomplishments in grain sorghum research at Kansas State University. Richard, some background on you and how you got started down this path.
Sure thing, Eric. I'll start back when I was growing up in a farm in Rooks County, Kansas. That's north of Hayes a little bit. Somehow or another, when I graduated, then I came to K-State. Did my undergraduate work here. First semester, my senior year, Roscoe Ellis was my advisor, and he said, you better think about doing graduate work. So I went off to Iowa State, did a master's and PhD there, and then in the summer of 1964, Floyd Smith offered me a job at K-State, and I've been here ever since.
Before we get into, if you will, the timeline of accomplishments in grain sorghum research, Richard, you wanted to share some general principles that go into all of this.
Yeah, compared to all of the other grain crops we grow, sorghum is the only perennial crop.
Right.
If it could, it'd grow forever. Back in the 1960s, there was a guy came over from Hawaii, talked about ratoon cropping of sorghum in Hawaii. Sugarcane was going out. Price of grain to ship to Hawaii to feed cattle was extremely high, and so they raised, somewhat successfully, 5 successive grain crops from one planting of sorghum. So it's a perennial. Secondly, I don't care what crop we're looking at, you need to know the growth and development of that crop. I used to use the analogy of a Model A Ford and say I knew how a Model A Ford ran, and with a pair of pliers and a screwdriver, I could fix about anything that was wrong with it. Mm-hmm. And then the final general thing is that this term maturity just drives me up the wall, because for years, the only thing that was called maturity in sorghum, genetically and by the seed companies, was bloom date. In fact, the maturity genes that determine bloom date are called maturity genes. But if you stop the crop there, you haven't produced a single bit of grain.
Right.
But those are the three things that, as far as sorghum is concerned, I want to start out, set those as a basis, and then go on from there.
Scott wanted to bring you in as a template of where grain sorghum research has been, is, and will be. You subscribe to pretty much all those as well, do you not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we still talk about a lot of those things. I still have to remind most of the younger generation that sorghum is a perennial, and so that changes the way they think about it, manage it, grow it, compared to, the annual crops they actually grow. We still in the industry get asked about maturities, and we'll give mid-bloom days to mid-bloom, and I'll usually give my tire. Every once in a while, someone will talk about how that doesn't work. Why don't we use heat units? And so then I'll go into I don't like days either because they're very inconsistent. Mm-hmm. So we could use heat units, but when sorghum goes into stress, the heat unit thing goes out the window. So then we come back to days is still the best thing we've got. And then someone will go, well, how many days to harvest? And I just kind of look at them and, try to change the subject, because that's probably even harder to get your arms around than the first one. So we still talk about the growth stages. We still talk about a lot of these things. Occasionally I get some of the people that work for me roll their eyes when I use the word phylacron, and they have to go look it up and talk about how leaf number drives maturity and some of these things that Richard's students over the years have all these things that have been figured out, because, again, we would look at how this plant grows and think we understood it. We tried to apply models or, with knowledge from crops like corn, and they kind of match up. Yeah. In some places, particularly if you think about emergence and root development, early root development, a lot of those things, maturities are still very similar. But the drought-tolerant nature and some of the drought avoidance mechanisms that sorghum has makes it completely different, which still makes it fascinating to me to this day, the amount of people that don't understand that. And so we still spend a lot of time educating people in the industry as well as customers, the farmers, on how all this works.
Well, let's go back to 64 roughly, and Richard, where it really was launched, and then we'll walk through the high points, if you will, along the way.
Glad to do that. And I'm glad Scott brought up students, because if it hadn't been for my students, we'd be through right now, because the work was all done by them.
The corporate we.
The corporate we, he's heard that a few hundred times, I suspect. Scott got his master's with me, incidentally, so when I came in December of 64, I inherited a project from Fred Stickler and a guy over in Ag Engineering whose name I've forgotten. And this was when the LP gas industry was trying to find a way to sell LP gas in the summer. And there was a guy out at La Crosse, Kansas, Flame Engineering, that had built a flame rig, and the way to get rid of weeds was to run that sucker through the field and just burn everything up. And I honestly don't remember who looked at that and said, what are we doing with that? Those plots are blooming later than the plots that didn't get flamed. And what good might that be other than just as weed control? And so we started looking at the possibility, could we set a set of stage of development, we'll come back to that in a little bit, severity of burn, and determine how long that delay is. Why do we want to do that? Seed production. What was the way to get seed production? You go back to the old-time breeders, J. Roy Quinby, the whole group. The maximum heterosis is from the biggest difference in the parents. How did they get it done? They did split plantings. And you can imagine, okay, you plant one and you wait a week and you get a 3-inch rain, not going to have much fun planting it. So we worked it out. The sorghum plant during grain fill produces more grain than it produces dry matter by photosynthesis during that same time period. What does that mean? That means that proportion, that 10% or that 25% of the grain that the farmer harvests was produced earlier, stored in the stalk, and moved into grain.
Which causes challenges still to this day, because that's why we end up with lodging issues in sorghum. That movement, that translocation can result in weaker stalks, stalk rot diseases, those kinds of things. The other thing that's important to point out is that wheat can do that. You talk about filling from the stem. Corn does not. And so it often causes a lot of challenges when people try to compare the two crops and talk about, I remember the corn tillering debate of 20 years ago, and then we're going to translocate all the material from the tillers into the plant, and might do it in sorghum, probably not going to do it in corn. And so, yeah, there's a lot of these things that, again, we don't think about the importance they have in yields and management. And again, we wouldn't know anything about it had this work not been done. And again, this is one of those, I think, that you have a lot of these in your career. It was kind of the ancillary result. You started off looking at question A and found answer A, B, C, and D.
Yeah. Very often it's what you think went wrong.
Right.
That's where you learn something.
Right.
And what this really amounted to in the end was that we had a lot of data under a lot of environments that we had at least yield data for. And that leads me to 1973. There were two guys from Temple, Texas, Joe Ritchie, a soil physicist, who I happened to be in grad school with him at Iowa State, and a young engineer, Jerry Arkin, were building a sorghum growth model. Now, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't too excited about crop modeling at that point. They were looking for somebody that had sorghum data. And so they came over and talked to me, and I said, okay, that's fine. You can have my data, but you got to take me with it. And so I spent half of 74 and half of 75 on sabbatical, Temple, Texas, at the Black Land Conservation Research Center, trying to help them put together a sorghum growth model.
Hold that thought, if you would, Richard. We'll take a break and return with more as we're looking back and ahead at grain sorghum research with K-State's Richard Vanderlip and from Chromatin Incorporated, Scott Staggenborg. This is Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and once more we've been presented the opportunity, by the way, courtesy of the Center for Sorghum Improvement here at K-State, to visit with a couple of the leaders in grain sorghum development over the past, several decades, as it turns out, as they're looking back with us at key advances in grain sorghum research and what might be some future objectives in improving this highly important crop to Kansas agriculture. Professor Emeritus now and crop physiologist at K-State for a long, long while, Richard Vanderlip is Mike's side, along with former K-State Research and Extension agronomist Scott Staggenborg. And Richard, just ahead of the break, you were getting into the creation and the development of that computer model that you had a hand in devising, which simulated grain sorghum production for research purposes. Talk about that modeling approach and what it brought to the cause here.
Well, it's an interesting situation. Basically, what it tried to do was, in a computer, grow a sorghum crop day by day. Mm-hmm. How much leaf area was developed, how much new material was produced, mm-hmm. Most importantly, what stage of development was it in. And this was then based on plant characteristics, soils, and weather data. And so our objectives from the beginning were to try to use this to look at management decisions. We found out we took on more than we could handle with what we thought we were going to do, and so that was where it started, was in Temple. Now someday off, even after Scott's gone, someday off in the future, somebody will understand the mechanisms of everything that goes on in that plant.
But to that end, I'm just going to jump in here. To that end, as I got to use the model later on, and have used it a lot. But as we began to study and understand the crop, you did a pretty good job. Despite the fact that it wasn't, meticulously mimicking the physiological processes. Right. Mm-hmm. In the end, the outcomes were still pretty good and matched things pretty well. I still think about the way that you determined head size. And all of those things, you had to back calculate basically how good conditions were back at, panicle initiation. Yeah. And, that's still how we think about and how we describe and how we work with farmers in helping them understand why their yield was good or bad in a given year by kind of doing that autopsy. And, that's the first question we always ask. Well, what were the conditions like when the plant was at about the 6th or 8th leaf stage, or the common thing, about this tall? And, and then you can drag that out. And the way they modeled that was perfect in terms of that description, even if maybe at the time it was done, it didn't have the perfect physiological basis for it.
So what was learned in the ultimate from the modeling then, beyond what Scott just said?
Well, one of the big things that was learned was what little we know about some of those processes.
Yeah.
I put down 3 things. Back to maturity. If you're doing a day-by-day growth of that sorghum in a computer, we could get bloom date reasonably well. Mm-hmm. But when and how do you tell that silly thing to quit growing? We know when flowering is in the model reasonably well. Just take half of that and add it on, that's mature. And then we started simulating planting dates. Think about that a little bit. The earlier you plant, the cooler it is. The cooler it is, the slower the plant grows. If you take half of that long time period and say that's going to be grain fill, oh boy, you've produced grains that nobody's ever seen. So that obviously didn't work. Right. Tillering. Anybody that's grown sorghum knows that if given a chance and if conditions are halfway decent, it's going to tiller.
Right.
Every time we found a hybrid that didn't tiller readily to do tillering work with, it went off the market. And grain fill, that was a mess. If you can't get maturity right, you haven't got a ghost of a chance of getting grain fill right. The model was very important at finding deficiencies in what we thought we knew about plant growth and development.
So you were able to apply the model, and you moved forward from there on all the aspects of grain sorghum productivity, did you not?
That's right. We put out a study with multiple planting dates and with 4 known pedigree hybrids, and we were going to try to somehow, hopefully, out of all this, figure out what maturity really, what physiological maturity, what end of grain filling really meant. And I had a young fellow working on the project, and one day he came in and said, "Richard, the earliest hybrid, if it bloomed on the same day as the latest hybrid, matured on the same day as the early hybrid." I said, "Jim, that can't be right." He said, "Come with me to the field." Well, he was right, as the students often are. He was the one that was out there doing the work. So then that got us to thinking, how much genetic variability is there in grain sorghum? And we put all that together, and Scott mentioned heat units. And so we figured out that if you did heat units, we came to the conclusion there was not a dime's worth of difference in duration of grain fill if it was calculated on a heat unit basis. Then that got me to thinking, how long have sorghum breeders been working on sorghum? Why, if there's genetic variability in duration of grain fill, hasn't it been found? And so every sorghum breeder that I knew got tired of talking to me because I'd harass them about, how can this be? You guys have been on this. I mean, my dad planted some of the first hybrids that came out, 1957 or whenever it was, and yet they all seem to be the same. We got to thinking about hybrids then. Craig Rosaboom was running the performance test at that time, and so I left a few dollars for Craig to pay for this kid, and he took notes on every hybrid that was in that year's sorghum performance test. Half bloom, physiological maturity. We plot them out this time as heat units during grain fill versus bloom date. Bloom dates here, heat units here. There was no question that duration of grain fill and time to flowering had no relationship whatsoever.
How revolutionary was that to confirm that?
Well, it's so revolutionary, nobody believes me yet, I don't think.
I was going to say, nobody believes me to this day. We had that conversation in-house. Again, we were talking about this situation, and I said, once you get to mid-bloom, the grain filling period's the same. And I had people across the table looking at me like, there's no way. Now, I agree with Richard that there are differences, and I think that it has been used in the industry, but since no one takes bloom notes, I know of a breeder that I've worked with that actually does what he would call pounds per day. And so what he would do would take the final yield and divide by the number of days to bloom. And that one of the hybrids that has been an industry leader for years was one he created, and it had the highest number of pounds per day, which again would indicate that for its maturity, it probably has a longer grain fill than everything else because it ends up with more grain. That has always been my speculation when I saw that.
Let's look ahead then, and Richard, ask you what you would like to see in as far as highlighted and emphasized areas of research to improve grain sorghum yields.
Okay. There are three things that I think should be looked at. Back in the, 1970s, I suppose, there was a lot of comparison between 2-dwarf and 3-dwarf hybrids. Mm-hmm. What that means is every sorghum that we grow today is a 3-dwarf hybrid. 2-dwarfs are roughly twice the height of the 3-dwarfs. But I don't know of anybody that studied those that didn't end up saying if they were genetically the same, except for that dwarfing gene, they increased yields. I think we ought to be looking more closely at taller hybrids. Obviously, grain fill duration. I think that's got the greatest potential of anything. If we could ever find out what really triggers the end of grain fill. I know I don't have any clue, and I don't think anybody else really knows what in that plant signals that it ought to shut down putting grain in. It's a perennial. It's still got a lot of leaf area. It's still producing. So that ought to be in there. The other thing, back when we were trying to figure out how we were going to do grain fill, we started thinking about, well, how does a sorghum plant fill grain? It starts at the top, blooms at the top, blooms down at the base, starts filling at the top, goes down. We looked at seed size. Okay, the top's got the biggest seed. Then the seed gets smaller. What happens if you get everything to pollinate, well, not pollinate, on the day before the rain comes through? Then you've gone from a poor yield to no yield. Those are the things I'd like to see in the future.
Well, Richard and Scott, it's been a pleasure going through this retrospect on grain sorghum research advances. We thank the both of you for being along with us right here. Longtime crop physiologist at K-State, Richard Vanderlip, and former K-State agronomist Scott Staggenborg, who is now with Chromatin Incorporated, based in Lubbock, Texas. And we'll be back in a few moments with more on this Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
I placed the potted plants in the shade in my kitchen, under the cedar trees.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Surely, the floating vultures were not looking for me. I'd showered and even shaved that morning. I think they just had fun with the updrafts above our hill. I'm quite sure they knew that I was working in the outdoor kitchen, even though they could not see me easily there under the trees. The outdoor kitchen is a sturdy workbench I made years ago to work on with potted plants. I did it especially to clean up all the potted geraniums I overwinter in the overwintering greenhouse I set up inside the garage. It's a very simple structure, but it works. In spring, I moved the plants out that I've grown lanky in the artificial light and need attention. Even though I've all good intentions in the fall when I bring the potted plants inside after pruning them back drastically then, I admit they're on their own once inside. Except for light, heat, and a few times watering. They have to tough it out. And they do. Even the other plants, like the hibiscus tree, go through that treatment. It is dormant, having lost all its leaves, but when I scraped the bark, it showed green, as it did the years before. So I expected to leave out in time once I put it outside again. But just like the geraniums, I placed the potted plants in the shade of my kitchen under the cedar trees. It's a very fun and easy place to work. A few years ago, while I was working there doing the same thing, Talina, my daughter, took a few pictures. They were good shots. She sent them to her cousin in the Netherlands to show him his uncle working in the kitchen. He, in turn, created an interesting photo composition with it. If I remember right, the theme called Places. That composition was chosen to hang in a display in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam during an exhibition. Just think, work of my daughter and me working on display. It's a proof that I enjoy myself working with plants. Back to Kansas and my hill. While I was busy in my kitchen, Talina and her mother went downtown to the garden centers to look at and buy plants for the many empty pots. I remixed my pile of garden soil so it would be ready when they came back, and I sorted the pots. They were the large, heavy clay pots as well as the plastic ones, which look like clay pots until you lift them. They're so much lighter in weight, and they don't break. By the time I had things ready, the car drove up the hill and backed up to the kitchen. That was a promising move. Easier to unload. They indeed unloaded. I won't say that the rear springs were flat, but a lot of beautiful annuals and a few perennials came out of the back. It was all placed near the kitchen. And when they made clear that they wanted to do the potting and were sure they could handle filling the pots with soil, I left them. The only thing I did when I saw how happy they were working at the creative job was to take, again, a few pictures. It's always good to have pictures to send overseas. I forgot to mention that as they backed up, I was by then resting in the wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrows can make very comfortable seats. Of course, Talina snapped that one. The old man, resting in a wheelbarrow. The day before, Talina and I worked together to clean up and fertilize all the potted geraniums, so everybody was in the swing. I left them alone except for taking the photos for posterity. This, of course, was a fun achievement for Anneke after last fall's operations. By now, the vultures had floated away. I expect one went back to the 2 eggs in the pony stable. As the afternoon progressed, I could see the rest of the hard work as finished pots were carried or rolled to their summer location. The hanging baskets, now filled with colorful plants, were hung back along the front porch and entrance. The heavy clay pots were rolled or carried to their places to stay. Several pots were placed on the deck, the place where we enjoy early morning tea. It's the best way to start the day and watch the birds in the feeders. A newcomer stopped by the other day. It was a rose-breasted grosbeak. I'm sure the female was there, but she's not as showy as the show-off, the male with black, white, and the deep rose chest. I must get another copy of the handy booklet, A Pocket Guide to Common Kansas Backyard Birds, by my friend Chuck Otte and Bob Kress. The booklet lays on my desk. It's very handy to have, and it is a good booklet. Back to the potted flowers, they are all standing or hanging now. Of course, the word all has to be taken with a grain of salt because I've added a few more pots. And I know my daughter will even bring more plants while she's on an errand. I keep seeing places next to a bench or in a vista where a display of color would be very nice. I admit that the border has been, if not neglected, but surely not evolving. It has been beautiful in the past, and we have photos to prove it. But deer like to graze on the lawn and step in and go through the border and nibble on plants. I will try zinnias seeded again. Between the rabbits and the deer and what Anneke needs for bouquets, I think we can reach a compromise. After all, we're all living here on the hill together.
Gus van der Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. And that is our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.